Breaking news this Friday night. The Prime Minister says enough is enough.
The barricades must come down.
What's pushed him to this point?
We can't have dialogue when only one party is coming to the table.
And what happens next? How will these blockades be removed? The new quarantine begins for about 200 Canadians, plus new COVID-19 emergencies in 2 countries. Russian interference, the 2020 edition. Fresh warnings the Kremlin is helping Trump win another election. And from bullied to bolstered.
You got a friend in me.
The international show of support for a young boy and his mother.
Global National with Dawna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with breaking news. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he has run out of patience with the railway blockades that have been crippling trade and travel across the country. The onus, he says, is now on Indigenous leaders to end them.
The barricades must now come down. The injunctions must be obeyed, and the law must be upheld.
Trudeau says his government has exhausted every possibility for dialogue with the small group of Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs whose opposition to a natural gas pipeline provoked the rail line barricades. Shortly after the Prime Minister made his position clear, the Wet'suwet'en chiefs who have traveled to Ontario responded. It didn't include any talk of ending the barricades now.
There is a difference between inconvenience and injustice. Total difference. Don't confuse one with the other.
They say they still want certain conditions met before anything happens. We'll get to that in just a moment. But first, Eric Sorensen on the Prime Minister's big shift in position and whether it means the barricades will come down.
Senior ministers huddled all day, confronting a dilemma, slow-moving talks and the fast-growing economic impact of Indigenous blockades. And so a new, tougher stance, a show of force that all of government has done its best. Dialogue has not moved things forward, and that, the Prime Minister says now, is unacceptable.
Canadians have been patient. Our government has been patient. But it has been 2 weeks, and the barricades need to come down now.
Prime Minister Trudeau says the RCMP have agreed without conditions now to take down the controversial outpost on a service road on the Wet'suwet'en land in northern BC. A core demand of the hereditary chiefs. What now about reconciliation?
There is a relationship to be renewed and new relationships to be built. Canada is ready for this. Canadians want this. But hurting Canadian families from coast to coast to coast does nothing to advance the cause of reconciliation.
The sudden shift in tone suggests the economic impact was hitting so quickly and so hard across the country that the government could not wait any longer.
The economic impact is dire.
In the House of Commons, the first 20 questions from all opposition parties showed the frustration building from coast to coast.
Supplies of propane in eastern Canada are reaching a critical level.
85 ships are in the Vancouver harbour waiting to be loaded.
Supermarket shelves are starting to empty out.
The Liberals have preached dialogue, but it was clear that patience for dialogue quickly wore thin.
Dialogue has its limits, Mr. Speaker. The blockades must go down.
The government says it's not for Ottawa, but for police to decide how best and how quickly to respond to the blockades. Conservative leader Andrew Scheer says the Prime Minister should do more than that.
He has refused to use the authority that he has. Now he is relying on the goodwill of the protesters to take down the barricades. That's not leadership.
But the Prime Minister is wary of the use of force. In terms of what happens next, Trudeau says the next move is up to the Wet'suwet'en chiefs.
The onus is on them.
Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
So one of the Wet'suwet'en chiefs is sticking to his line now that nothing will happen until the RCMP leave their traditional territory in northern BC. You'll remember the police set up an outpost there to enforce a court injunction and remove a blockade on a service road. Our Mike Le Couteur is in Tyendinaga, Ontario. That's where some Wet'suwet'en chiefs met with Mohawk supporters today. Mike, did what the Prime Minister said today mean they've changed their position at all?
Not really, Dawna, and they wanted to clarify that position by inviting the media to speak with the hereditary chiefs after that meeting with the Mohawks here at the community center. And what they said was, our demands are twofold. The first is that the RCMP completely withdraw from the Wet'suwet'en territory. And we know the RCMP has offered to go to Houston, BC. It's unclear if that will be enough. The second one is that they want Coastal GasLink to completely cease all operations and all construction there. And they say only after those two conditions are met can they have true nation-to-nation dialogue. It could come in the form of speaking directly with the Prime Minister. They're open to that. They're also open to speaking with either the Crown and Indigenous Relations Minister, Carolyn Bennett, or the Indigenous Services Minister, Mark Miller. But they want to make sure that that dialogue is started, but not before those two conditions are met. And they wanted to make it abundantly clear for all Canadians and for the Prime Minister. Have a listen.
We demand the remote detachment, community industry, service office established by the RCMP on Wet'suwet'en territory without our consent be immediately removed, and that the RCMP are completely removed from our territory and cease patrols from our lands. Out means out.
So what is it the protesters where you are on Mohawk territory want to bring the barricades down there?
Yeah, they said that their demand has not changed. They will let the rails restore service and that the rail cars can go by for one thing, and that would be that the RCMP withdraw from the Wet'suwet'en land. The difficulty that we're hearing now and in the community late tonight is that they are extremely nervous that now that the Prime Minister says those injunctions must be carried out and they must go through, there's concern that the Ontario Provincial Police will move in as night falls here and dismantle the barricades. So Dawna, if you thought that it was already tense before, because it is, well, that tension has just been ratcheted up another notch.
All right, Mike Le Couteur and Tyendinaga territory in Ontario, thanks. It's finally home time for a group of Canadians caught in the chaos of the COVID-19 outbreak. 2 weeks after they were airlifted out of Wuhan, China, a group of people left CFB Trenton free from quarantine and back to their regular lives. But the clock has just started ticking on a 14-day quarantine of Canadians who were on board the Diamond Princess cruise ship. 129 of them landed in Canada this morning. Mike Armstrong was there as the buses pulled up in Cornwall, Ontario.
They are going from one 14-day quarantine to another. After 2 weeks on what some called a floating prison, the Canadian Diamond Princess passengers' home for the next 2 weeks is a convention center. They're in an isolated wing of the NavCan facility, a big improvement. According to one couple, the Chows, speaking from their new room, say they understand the quarantine is to protect them and the public.
I don't mind this 14 days. Both myself and my wife, we agree that we should take this extra 14 days to be virus-free.
Now, in addition to the passengers brought back, there are about 24 other people being put in quarantine. Anyone who came in contact with them on the way back. Everyone from medical staff and flight crew to the bus drivers. Some will be evaluated. If there wasn't much contact, they could be released early. But health officials are being careful.
As far as I'm concerned, people who are on the cruise will have to stay here for 14 days.
There were fewer passengers repatriated than expected. About 70 Canadians declined the government flight home and stayed in Japan. Having completed the quarantine on the ship, the Japanese government is now letting them off and they're free to move around the country. But when they return to Canada, they will be put in quarantine, public health officials say, whether in a day, a week, or 3 months from now. Two governments are seeing the risk of bringing back passengers from the Diamond Princess. Israel repatriated 11 citizens and Friday announced one has tested positive. Australia repatriated 30 and is confirming 2 cases. In each one, the passengers tested negative boarding the plane home and positive once they arrived.
It's not unexpected that some people might have been incubating the virus.
COVID-19 ripped through the Diamond Princess. There were more than 600 cases. Experts say something went wrong with the quarantine. The passengers now back in Canada will be checked twice daily. They're also being offered psychological help to get them through the understandable emotional stress. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Cornwall, Ontario.
And public health officials in British Columbia are trying to figure out how a woman contracted COVID-19 after returning from Iran. The woman in her 30s is BC's 6th confirmed case, and hers is being described as unusual. Iran only confirmed its first COVID-19 cases this week. The total official number of cases there is 18, and 4 people have died. It's not clear where the BC woman picked up the virus. Authorities here say it may show the outbreak is more widespread than what official numbers are showing. In South Korea, authorities are struggling to contain a fast-spreading outbreak there. In one day, the number of cases has nearly doubled to more than 200. Dozens of them are linked to a fringe religious group in the city of Daegu. And there's another emergency unfolding in northern Italy. 14 new COVID-19 cases have been confirmed in a handful of small towns, bringing the total in Italy to 17. Schools, restaurants, and businesses have been shut down to try to stop the spread. The federal privacy watchdog is investigating if Clearview AI, the company behind controversial facial recognition software used by police, violates Canadian privacy laws. The app cross-references images of people against billions of photos on the web without consent. Last month, the New York Times revealed the technology was already being used to make arrests in the U.S., and that prompted Global News to ask Toronto police if they were using the software. They revealed the technology had been used for months by officers without the knowledge of the police chief. Police in Toronto, as well as Peel, Halton, and Durham regions of Ontario, have since ordered their officers to stop using it. There are new accusations. The Russians are up to their old tricks. Intelligence officials have reportedly told American lawmakers there's evidence Russia is again attempting to interfere in the presidential election. And one of their key goals is to get President Donald Trump re-elected. Jackson Prosco reports on the troubling new warning and Trump's furious response.
Despite running for re-election on his record, Donald Trump is anxious to distance himself from his past.
They said today that Putin wants to be sure that Trump gets elected. Here we go again.
The president reportedly became furious after learning that U.S. intelligence officials are once again sounding the alarm about Russian election interference. In a classified briefing, lawmakers were told the Kremlin is continuing its efforts from 2016, hoping to help re-elect Trump. The president was upset that Democrats like Adam Schiff were included in the briefing, fearing the information could be used against him. Angry, he fired his acting director of national intelligence and appointed his ambassador to Germany, a fierce loyalist, to the role.
It's disinformation. That's the only thing they're good at.
Russia called the accusations from U.S. intelligence officials paranoid announcements. But fears of renewed meddling are not exactly a secret. Trump's own FBI director issued a public warning earlier this month.
And have never stopped seeing, really, since 2016, efforts to engage in malign foreign influence by the Russians.
That influence extends across party lines, with word that Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders has also been briefed by U.S. officials about Russian attempts to help his campaign.
But the threat isn't going away. Every member of Congress is set to receive a briefing on election security in the next 2 weeks, amidst warnings that Russia and other nations are refining their meddling and misinformation tactics. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
Oil and gas companies promising to be carbon neutral. Is that even possible? Coming up, a global national reality check. The deadline for a big decision is looming about a massive resource project in Alberta. The federal cabinet must decide whether to approve the Tech Frontier oil sands mine, a $20 billion mega project proposed for northeastern Alberta. Along with producing crude, it would also generate about 4 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions every year. Yet Teck and other resource companies have vowed to reduce their emissions to net zero. Is that possible? Tonight, Heather Yurix West has a reality check.
To environmental groups like Greenpeace, the decision before federal cabinet should be easy.
The Trudeau government has joined other countries around the world in answering sort of the call of scientists saying we need to get to zero emissions by 2050. And so we say you can't actually approve a massive new oil sands mine to operate until 2067 if you say we're going to be off fossil fuels 17 years earlier.
But getting to net zero isn't necessarily the same as getting off fossil fuels entirely. Globally, the demand for oil and gas is not expected to disappear for decades, even as the world begins to transition to a low-carbon economy.
As long as there is demand for fossil fuels, somebody is going to be supplying it.
Still, energy companies have come to realize that as global demands shift, only the greenest will survive. It's why over and over major players in the industry from BP and Teck to Repsol and Cenovus are making the same promise, pledging to be carbon neutral by 2050.
All these large companies really do have to be making this sort of a move at this point. There is a huge drive from the investment community with very, very large funds having stated that they're not going to invest in fossil fuels, and one of the main reasons has to do with the greenhouse gas emissions.
The net zero pledge isn't the same across the board. For a company like Teck, the promise only covers its production methods.
It's actually not that hard because they're not talking about making their end product net zero. They're just saying our operations by 2050 will no longer use oil and gas to fuel them. Will no longer create CO2 emissions. And to be honest, the technology for that already exists.
BP, on the other hand, is promising to offset emissions from their products as well, a move that will require investing more heavily away from oil.
So where does that leave a project like Teck Frontier? The reality is, whatever the government ultimately decides may be irrelevant. The company has said it needs oil prices to rise significantly before it commits to investing in the project. Political will aside, at the moment, the project just doesn't make financial sense. Heather, Eurex West Global News, Calgary.
Recovered, relapsed, and repeat offenders. Ahead, calls for change in Canadian prisons. Here's a cold, hard truth about the majority of people convicted of crimes and behind bars in this country. They have a history of substance abuse and often don't get the support they need. Yesterday, we introduced you to an Ottawa man, Elliot Hudson, who has been in and out of jail and rehab. His story is not unique. Tonight, we look at what has to change to break the cycle. Abigail Beeman has part 2 of our series, Addicted and Imprisoned.
Addicts don't need to be thrown in jail.
Long before Elliot Hudson sat behind bars, he was passionate about the criminalization of addictions. He wanted to write his master's thesis on the topic. He ended up living it, a messy cycle of rehab and relapse and convictions.
It's extremely damaging because when you relapse, there's so much shame and guilt that just perpetuates more using, and it creates a cycle that's very, very difficult to get out of.
It's a relapsing illness. If there's a relapse, there's sometimes a concept of, oh, see, treatment doesn't really work. Right. But we don't do that in other parts of healthcare.
The psychiatrist in chief at the Royal Ottawa Mental Health Centre says one of the biggest challenges people with addictions face is a lack of understanding around treatment and stigma. Still, around 3/4 of Canadian inmates in federal institutions have a history of substance abuse. Access to treatment can be a problem.
The amount of money that is spent on treatment is far too negligible when you look at the nature and extent of the problem.
That's the correctional investigator for the federal prison system. And in the country's biggest province, the latest Auditor General's report says Ontario jails are not suited to provide appropriate care to inmates with mental health issues, and the number of those inmates is on the rise.
Not only are people criminalized for things that they have done when they've experienced mental health struggles or drug use issues, that the way that the system interacts with them often sets them up for failure.
The data is still pretty sparse on reoffending. There are so many other factors that play into it, but we do know that that retention and treatment is a protective element.
Dr. Laurie Regenstreef is an addictions expert who's worked in Ontario jails. She sees people incarcerated all the time with drug problems left unresolved.
They go out and don't do well. They go out and they overdose. They go out and they come back in again. And it's all about really not having those needs addressed.
As for Elliot Hudson, he's still working to address his needs. He's checked back into rehab at the Royal Ottawa. And yes, he's been here before.
I've got a lot of good things in my life today compared to where I was. I may not be exactly where I want. It's still a journey. Recovery doesn't happen overnight.
A journey he hopes to share to help others like him. His story isn't over. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
Next, bullied to the brink of suicide. One boy's tragic story gets worldwide attention. We've reported many times on the impact bullying has on kids. We like to think it happens less than it used to, but now a video has emerged from Australia, a heartbreaking video that's hard to watch. The mother of a 9-year-old Indigenous boy posted it because she's so worried. Quaden Bales has dwarfism. He's constantly picked on by his peers and talks about wanting to kill himself. Since she posted it, the response has been overwhelming.
This is the effect that bullying has. I'm gonna kill myself. This is what bullying does.
It is so hard to watch. Yet it's what Quaden Bales' mother says she hears from her son almost every day when she picks him up from school.
And I've got a son that is suicidal almost every single day. This is what it's doing. And I want people to know how much it is hurting us as a family. I want people to educate their children.
She didn't want to keep it hidden anymore, wanted the world to know how bullying can destroy lives.
This could be your child, or your child could be the bully that pushes a kid over the edge. Being an Aboriginal boy with a disability, people don't understand that's a double-edged sword. It's racism and then also discriminated against because of a disability.
The video now has more than 21 million views. The outpouring of love has been overwhelming.
Quaden, know that you are important. Know that you are loved.
The message amplified by celebrities like actor Hugh Jackman.
Quaden, you are stronger than you know, mate. And no matter what, you got a friend in me.
Comedian Brad Williams, who also has dwarfism, said the video makes him sick and that Quaden has an army of friends all over the world. He set up a GoFundMe page to send Quaden and his mother on vacation to Disneyland. More than $300,000 has been raised so far, and Quaden's been asked to lead the Indigenous All-Stars Rugby League team onto the field for an exhibition match on Sunday.
He said it was going from the worst day of his life to the best day of his life.
Education, his mother says, starts at home, and she and her son have just given the world a powerful lesson.
And that is Global National for this Friday. I'm Dawna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Wheatley, Ontario. We'd love to see your Canada. Please email it to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching. Have a lovely weekend, and I'll see you back here on Monday. Bye-bye.